Welcome back. Thanks for joining me. Today I want to spend a few minutes to talk with you about taking a stand. The Bible documents all kinds of people who took a stand for God. Maybe you think about Moses and Aaron going before Pharaoh and demanding that Pharaoh let God's people go into the wilderness to worship. Maybe you think about Elijah condemning Ahab for all of the wickedness that he had committed in leading God's people into idolatry. Maybe you think of Queen Esther, who politically maneuvered the saving of the Jewish people. In the New Testament, you might think of people like Peter and John or Paul, who very boldly held government officials to account for their unrighteousness. Of course, the Bible commands us as Christians that we're to take a stand. We're to use our influence to defend the cause of God in the world. In 1 Peter chapter 3 and verses 14 through 16, Peter writes about how we're to be willing to suffer for the sake of righteousness, and that we're to have a willingness to defend what we believe, to defend the hope that we have. In the short letter of Jude, in verse 3, we're told that we're to earnestly contend for the faith that was once delivered to the saints. The question is, though, is how do we do that? How do we take a stand? The culture around us has a very self-serving way of taking a stand. For example, if you watch a few minutes of cable news, you'll find cable news personalities and political figures engaging in shouting matches constantly. If you go to social media, you'll find people who instantaneously and thoughtlessly react to events and create a lot of heat rather than bringing light to truth. Of course, religious discussions are often tense when we feel that our beliefs are being questioned. We often feel threatened, and when threatened, our flight or fight response kicks in, and we might become very ugly in how we express what we believe. When cooler heads prevail, no one's mind is changed about anything. Taking a stand is an art. Being a Christian is an art. And like any art, it requires skill that is carefully practiced over time. It requires actions that are deliberate and meaningful. And that same kind of careful thought has got to go into how we defend God and express the gospel in our world. So what's required? What's involved in taking a stand? Well, first of all, we need to have a strong moral awareness in taking a stand. We need to be cognizant of the stark difference between right and wrong and good and evil. Often today, people are confused about the difference between good and evil. Our culture is very much like that of Israel in the days of Isaiah. Isaiah talked about how the people had confused good and evil, that they called good evil and evil good. And that very much is prevalent today. If we exchange good for evil, then we can be promoting and defending evil. So we need to have a very strong moral awareness about the kinds of things we defend. Not only does strong moral awareness inform what we should be defending, but it also informs how we go about doing that. God, of course, made a very strong distinction between good and evil, and He did that consistently over time in a variety of ways. Most significantly, God made a distinction between good and evil at the cross. In John chapter 16, in verses 9 through 11, Jesus talks about how the cross represented judgment being passed upon the world and upon the prince of this world. But what does that mean to us? Well, that means that through the gospel, God has made a distinction between good and evil. The gospel enables us to make very wise discernments. Moral intelligence is desperately needed to aid us and guide us in taking a stand. Secondly, taking a stand involves us being willing to sacrifice. There are many people perhaps who are willing to to take a stand or voice their opinion in a variety of forums. Very few people, though, are willing to sacrifice for their beliefs. In 1 Peter chapter 3, the text I referenced a few minutes ago, and verses 14 and 16 talks about how we're to have a willingness to suffer for righteousness. That means we have to be willing to sacrifice for doing and speaking on behalf of God as his ambassadors in the world. Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount described about we find contentment through suffering persecution. Doing what is right, standing up for what is right, is rarely rewarded. And that might be surprising the first time we encounter it. The thought we might have is, well, if what we're saying, if what we're calling for is right, then people should appreciate that. And sometimes they might, but more often than not, they will not appreciate it. They might try to silence us or do things to undermine our credibility and undermine our message. The question is, are we willing to sacrifice for taking a stand? It is Jesus, after all, who calls us to sacrifice. In Matthew chapter 16 and verse 24, he calls us to be willing to deny ourselves, to take up our cross and follow him. That we're to be willing to lose our life in order to find our life. The art of taking a stand involves a willingness to sacrifice. Number 3, the art of taking a stand involves graceful speech. And perhaps this is where much of our struggle can be found. In Colossians chapter 4 and verses 3 through 5, the Apostle Paul describes talking to unbelievers and how through these opportunities we're to have grace in our speech as we make wise use of opportunities to express the gospel to unbelievers or to outsiders, as the text sometimes says. The question is, are we graceful in our speech? Well, often we may not be. Sometimes when our beliefs are questioned, when we engage in religious moral discussions, it can become very tense and heated. And if we're inartful in our speech and we view confrontations as just about winning an argument, not wanting to look bad, then pride gets in the way, and pride can destroy and ruin that moment and the potential that it has to change and persuade someone's thinking. In 2 Timothy chapter 2 and verses 24 through 26, Paul talks about how the servant of the Lord must not strive, but should be meek and gentle as they seek to persuade the thinking of those who are held captive by the devil. Ultimately, souls are at stake, and we need to be aware of that as we try to persuade the thinking of other people to the truth. And lastly, the art of taking a stand involves glorifying God. Glorifying God is the only acceptable motivation in our taking a stand. In 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 11, Peter writes about how our speaking and how our serving is to be done to the glory of God. I appreciate you spending some time with me today. I hope the lesson has been helpful as we think about the art of taking a stand. Don't let the culture shape how you defend the truth. Taking a stand involves knowing what to say, when to say it, and how to say it. In the gospel, God's word, it informs us how we're to do that. We're to speak the truth in love. And if we will commit to that, we will be effective in advancing the cause of the kingdom in the hearts and minds of other people. Thank you, and have a nice day.